Good evening. Hello, my name is Emily Owens, and I am an assistant professor in the history department here at Brown. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you to RESPECT ABILITY. Respectability, Black Women's Studies Since Righteous Discontent. We've convened this event to reflect on Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham's Righteous Discontent and her concept, the politics of respectability. I'm thrilled to be able to welcome such an esteemed and enthusiastic group of scholars to our campus to think together about the history of Black women's enactments of the politics of respectability, the history of the analytic itself, and the ways that this term has traversed African American women's history, Black feminist theory, and the world far beyond the academy. I stand here in my capacity as a member of the Brown faculty and as a recipient of the profound gifts and general grace of Tricia Rose, director of the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America, who has insisted on the centrality of women of color feminisms in the scholarly life of this university, and who makes material the fine balance of intellectual and community at the center every day. Thank you. I also want to thank Stephanie LaRue, Caitlin Murphy-Scott, Christina Downs, and Stacy Ferreira at the CSREA, without whom this idea would be just that, an idea. They have worked diligently over the past 18 months to make the next 2 days happen, and their intellectual energy and logistical genius simply cannot be overstated. Before going any further, I'd like to thank them for facilitating every single aspect of the coming events. I'd also like to thank the intersectional workshop of women of color feminisms at Brown, and especially Bonnie Honig and Tricia Rose, and all of our supporters and co-sponsors, especially the Departments of History and American and Ethnic Studies, Africana Studies and the Rights and Reason Theater, and the Pembroke Center for Teaching and Research on Women. And finally, I'd like to thank the Brown Bookstore, and especially Tova Beiser, for my ability to say the next thing, which is, I'd like to invite you to check out book sales after this event and at points tomorrow. So I'd like to just briefly frame the events that will take place this evening and tomorrow all day in Pembroke Hall. The notion of this gathering emerged because I was, as I think many of us probably are at the beginning of any given semester, paging through Righteous Discontent to assign a chapter to my students. I was struck when I stumbled across the copyright date, which indicated that we were about to crest over the 25th anniversary of its publication. This was a couple of years ago. I was paging through Righteous because nearly 3 decades after its publication, this book remains not only relevant to, but also essential to research and teaching in the fields of African American women's history, African American history, Black feminist theory, American history, women's history, feminist theory. I was teaching this book because I live in a world in which university classes regularly convene around topics related to the histories of Black women's lives. I was teaching this book because I have been the recipient of the sustained and exacting mentorship of Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham. Over the next several days, we will reflect on the politics of respectability along these multiple scales, discussing the life of a concept and the fields of African American women's history and Black feminist theory, which grew up alongside and gained credence because of the scholarship of Higginbotham and her peers. Over the next 2 days, I look forward to thinking together about how the politics of respectability came to resonate as a necessary tool for thinking about the history and present of Black women's lives, cultures, and strategies, how this concept has been of use beyond Black women's studies, and how it has lived beyond the academy. will reflect on the continued influence of the politics of respectability to the shape and content of our own research. And I look forward to observing the networked conversation in which Higginbotham's legacy and the legacy of this book exist. Indeed, it's become difficult to think the politics of respectability without also simultaneously considering Darlene Clark Hine's The Culture of Dissemblance. Where would we be without the culture of dissemblance? We might ask other similar questions. What wouldn't we know about culture and performance if not for Farah, Jasmine, Griffin? Would any of us even think hip-hop was a reasonable object of scholarly attention without Tricia Rose? In 1989, Professor Higginbotham argued, quote, "The sound of silence resonates throughout much of the scholarship on Afro-Americans and women and reflects the failure to recognize Black women's history as not only an identifiable field of inquiry in its own right, but as an integral part of Afro-American, American, and women's history." This conference, this gathering, is an opportunity to pause and to listen to the sound of hundreds of historical monographs and articles published, of PhDs granted, of tenure lines secured, and of departments established. That is, to the sound of an entire field of study that was raised up in the steady hands of Black women scholars. And so my hope is that reflecting on the politics of respectability and righteous discontent calls us also to reflect on the tradition of institution building, intergenerational mentorship, and scholarly generosity and friendship that brought forth Black women's studies. Black women's studies has invented and maintained a mode of doing scholarship that we hope to honor in the coming days. Indeed, the many relationships that cross-cut this room are a testament to the ethic of mentorship that is the heartbeat of this field. So let me say it plain. The scholarly work of Black women's studies has made new modes of thought possible, has made stories tellable. And while writing new stories, Black women's historians have also written into existence a new way of being in the academy. Let us spend the coming days reflecting on and celebrating both the intellectual and institutional legacy of the politics of respectability as a concept, as well as the field to which it belongs. And with that, I'd like to introduce Tricia Rose, Director of the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America, who will lead us in our opening plenary session.
Wow, hard act to follow, for sure. Thank you, Emily. Can you hear me? Yes? It's rare people don't hear me, actually. Thank you, Emily, for your inspiring opening remarks. I want to echo a warm welcome to our guests, especially to our distinguished panel of speakers this afternoon, and to all of you here for coming. I'm so delighted to see such a full house. As Emily said, my name is Tricia Rose, and I'm a professor in the Department of Africana Studies and the director of the Center for the Study of Race and Ethnicity in America, CSREA. There are so many people who thanks are due. I would be really silly to try to repeat everything that Emily said, but I want to mention a few people because the support and collaboration it takes to bring an event like this into existence is so significant. I mean, they say it takes a village. I think it takes a village to host a conference. In the interest of time, I'll say ditto squared to 90% of Emily's thank yous, but I want to personally and especially thank the tireless and dedicated staff at CSREA. You have no idea how extraordinary they are. But it is also true they wouldn't work there were it not for institutional support. And for that, I'm grateful to President Paxson, Provost Locke, and Dean Kevin McLaughlin for their support of CSREA and my efforts to build a durable and exciting hub at Brown. Finally, I want to thank Emily Owens. She is a fantastic, brilliant, and generous colleague. Without her, this event would never have happened. Working with her has been a complete pleasure. Tonight's opening panel and the panels throughout the day tomorrow reflect the mission of CSREA in a number of ways. We support and generate rigorous and accessible research, performance, art, and scholarship on a broad range of issues and topics and themes related to race and ethnicity, cross-cutting with gender, to help build a greater understanding and a more just world. Building research community and expanding research networks are at the heart of our work. But innovative ideas have to be nurtured in spaces where a cohort of researchers share a core set of questions and interests, but are also interested in testing and transcending conventional wisdom and existing boundaries. This event and the intergenerational mentorship and intellectual legacy that it reflects was built by Black women scholars who valued the social worlds of Black women. Even though many disciplines considered, and I'd say maybe consider in the present tense, it a marginal and often irrelevant field. Maintaining and expanding this kind of space for intellectual innovation on race and ethnicity and gender is at the heart of what we do at CSREA. And so we're thrilled to have organized this conference with Professor Owens and hope to inspire the next generation's contribution to this tradition of building an intellectual legacy and continuing the tradition of intellectual intergenerational mentorship. So the plan for this opening plenary is as follows. We printed out a rather detailed program with everyone's extensive bios, so we're not going to read them out loud to you because we think you can read perfectly well on your own, and it would take too long, and I want to hear from my brilliant colleagues. So we've distributed these programs, and we direct you to these programs to learn more about our guests. In terms of the specific process, each speaker will share their remarks from this podium and then return to their seat because we're going to also see a visual presentation. After everyone has spoken, we will all convene around this charming coffee table on the stage for group dialogue. I think I've convened around this coffee table, I don't know, maybe 50 times at this point. I should buy it. The exchange around this table and dialogue back and forth among the panelists will be followed by an open Q&A and discussion with the audience. So our speakers will speak in the following sequence. I will not come up here to introduce them one at a time. So Professor Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham will begin the entire program. She will be followed by Professor Sharon Harley, then Professor Darlene Hine, Professor Farah Griffin, and Professor Martha Jones. And after all of this programming, there will be, and the Q&A, there will be a short reception and also book sales by as many books as we could fit on the table. So please join me in welcoming Professor Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham to the podium.
So honored. I can't even begin to tell you, and I'm so proud. I have, Emily was so brilliant as a student, as a graduate student, and now she is a professor here. And Tricia Rose, I just want to say before I go on that this is truly intergenerational, and it means a lot because the pioneers, I couldn't have written Righteous Discontent without Darlene Hine and Sharon Harley, And then there was this other generation, younger, Farah Griffin and Martha Jones, and Tricia Rose. So this is wonderful. And then now to see all of you, I am so honored. Righteous Discontent, Darlene asked me, when you were finishing it off, did you ever think that the politics of respectability would be with us still? And I told her, I was just trying to finish it off. But I will say that if you asked me about this, outside of the book, I think it's something we grapple with as African American women, especially. And it's something that's been with us a very long time. And so I think that is one of the reasons the book resonates both in the past and with our lives now. Now, I will also admit to you that I see the controversy of the politics of respectability. People use the term respectability politics, and often it's not used in a good way. And often, I've even seen on YouTube, I was telling them, someone was doing a YouTube that said something like, and can you believe talking about me, she actually said, and then it was about the politics of respectability. And I thought, my goodness, I'm a historian, I'm just writing about this. So I do know that it also can evoke emotion. But I thought that I would talk about what I thought I was doing and read to you some of what I thought I was doing. Because I was writing a book about these women in the Black Baptist Church. And these were women, number one, who were religious, number two, who lived in an era both of what we call the Victorian era, but also an era that we call Jim Crow. This was the time of convict leasing and mass lynchings and riots, and just on every level of society, the thought that black people were inferior and that they had their own special, separate, and segregated space, and that we didn't have anything worthy to contribute. They lived in that world. They also lived in a world where it was the woman's era, and they were infused with this gender consciousness. And they also lived in a world where they were dealing with class in the black community. Now, one of the issues that comes up often, and so I'm just really eager to see how we talk about that this week, is the conservative side. I developed a dually, and I want to emphasize dual, conservative and progressive side. Too often, though, it's the conservative side that gets emphasized. And one of the reasons the conservative side gets emphasized is because it is perceived as the voice of the middle class, the bourgeois, that looks down on the others. But that's not the group I wrote about. I wrote about the others. And so I talk about their conservative side, so I thought I wouldn't spend a lot of time with that because I know a lot of you are familiar with the conservative critique of them, and I make a conservative critique of them. But I wanted to share with you what I understand their progressive side. And so to do that, you have to talk about class. Now, I'm talking about women in the Black Baptist Church. If any of you go to Baptist churches, you know it is not an elite, at least most of the most churches. It's not made up primarily of elite people, and especially not in that time period. 80% of black women, working women in 1910, were domestic servants if they weren't working in agricultural work. And so this women's convention, most of its membership were domestic servants. And so when they are talking through their leaders in their reports, they are voicing these issues. Now, let me show you the difference between these women and the women of what we call the club women of the National Association of Colored Women. The leader of the National Association of Colored Women, a woman named Mary Church Terrell, was a very famous woman, and she was in Washington, D.C., but she was a woman internationally known. And she was one of the founding members of what was called the NACW. And this was the black middle class, even upper middle class. And this is what she's saying in 1904. She's telling her members that it's a good thing that we have this motto, lifting as we climb, because we live in an era of uplift. And this is what she says. In no way could we live up to such a sentiment better than coming into closer touch with the masses of our women, by whom, whether we will or not, the world will always judge the womanhood of the race. Even though we wish to shun them and hold ourselves entirely aloof from them, we cannot escape the consequences of their acts. So that if the call of duty were disregarded altogether, policy and self-preservation would demand that we go down among the lowly, the illiterate, and even the vicious, to whom we are bound by the ties of race and sex, and put forth every possible effort to uplift and reclaim them. Now, that's what I have in Righteous Discontent. But that's not the story of the women I'm writing about. So the women I'm writing about contrast themselves to just that kind of voice. And this is what they call themselves, persevering poor, daily toilers, common everyday women, the common people whom God made more of than the other kind. And Nanny Burroughs, who was the voice for these women, this is how she characterizes them. We do ourselves honor when we have associated with us in our religious life women who think it a disgrace not to toil, rather than those who look down in disdain upon those who work an honest living. It doesn't require very much to work for an honest living, but it does require a lot of character and brains not to scorn labor. And it requires a great deal of both in this day of false pride to earn your bread by sweating for it, holding up your head above public sentiment, and feeling in your heart that though you are a servant, yet you are a queen. Now that's uplifting. And then the other thing she does is she critiques the club women. Now she understands the positive work of the club women, and she interacts with the club women. But her major role is bringing voice, and the other officers do too. I don't have time to talk about all the other people, but she brings voice to them. These over 1 million women, literally, in this women's convention. Now, this is what she says to contrast. And she was always candid. And she denounces the social butterfly, and I quote her, who smooths her well-gloved hand while she studies the wonderfully interesting slum problem as a diversion. And then she goes on to say, if you really want to work with somebody, and I quote her, go out of your way to get an ordinary, common sense, spirit-filled, everyday woman. There are thousands of them to be had. And you can do more work in 1 month with this type of woman than you can do in 1 year with the would-be social leader who is entering these organizations devoted to uplift for no other reason than to show her finery and to let her less fortunate sisters see how brilliantly she shines. Now, these are the voices of the respectability. Okay, then she, when she says, well, where would you know, who are these people? Where would you find them? And then she goes on, and I'm getting this from their records now. This is not Nanny Burroughs writing letters. This is in the record of their minutes, their proceedings. There is an army of them down in the bottoms. And these people live in the lower parts of cities. They live in alleys. They live in places that environmentally it's unsafe. There's an army of them down in the bottoms that you have never seen and never will see until you walk the streets of the New Jerusalem. The women throughout this country are waking up. So now she's talking about this gender consciousness. The ordinary, everyday, pure-hearted women who have not lifted their souls to vanity nor sworn deceitfully are lining up. The common people of whom God has made more than of the other kind are shouting the tidings of salvation as they dig the trenches and throw up the breastwork for battle. And when she's talking about battle, she's not just simply talking about religion, she's talking about the battle against racism. Here's another example of their progressive side, because they are very conscious of the need for the right to vote. Black people are not voting in the South. And this is in 1915, 1916. For the most part, black men nor women are voting. But this is a movement of women who wants to see women's suffrage. But they're not oblivious to racism and the suffrage. So in her report, Nanny Burroughs, and I quote her again, the women voters will be keen to see that laws are passed that will give 8 hours a day and ensure a square deal and human treatment to women in other industries, because she was really interested in their work conditions. But that she says, but those same women who want the vote and talk about all this, they will oppose any movement that will, in the end, prevent them from keeping their cooks and house servants in the kitchen 12 or 15 hours a day, or storing them away in cellars, or over garages, or in attics. The only possible way for the domestic workers to get what others will demand and finally get is to organize their own unions. And then she goes on to say, first-class work demands first-class treatment. Now, here are some other progressive sides to the politics of respectability, because once you understand that you are worthy of respect, now this has nothing to do with that you think you are worthy because white people think you're worthy. This has something to do that you think you're worthy because you are in a community where most people are poor. So you can't look at your status based on income or education or your big house. But you can say, I am a person of integrity, I am a person of worth. And in fact, they tell women, especially to teach their children that, because there are so many outside influences that demean children. Any person who gets on a bus and then has to be put into the segregated side automatically realizes that they are being treated differently. And so what they do, and I find it really fascinating, because they take a stand on segregation in transportation. And I'm going to read to you how they evolve in their position between 1904 and 1918. And for those of you who know legal history, one of the strategies that Charles Hamilton Houston used with the NAACP to end segregation was to first make the case that separate was not being met. I mean, the equal wasn't being met with the separate but equal. And then move from that to separate was just never going to get us equal. But decades before Charles Houston was on the scene, this is what the women said. In 1904, they had a report calling for a united protest against the unsanitary toilet facilities for black women. When you're riding on trains, and I think of Toni Morrison and Sula, remember when they had to get out of the train and go into a field? So they're saying, this is just ridiculous. We demand equal treatment. We want step boxes for getting onto the train, and we want good facilities. We want them upgraded, even though they're separate. Well, that didn't go anywhere. So then in 1908, they send a petition to Congress, and they even appoint a group to go before the Interstate Commerce Commission. And this is what they say. The women of this convention will never be reconciled to the toilet arrangements. Everybody else may get tired of talking about this, but we are at least going to say that we don't like it because it is indecent. We want a separate toilet for colored women just as they have a separate toilet for white women. We want basins, we want soap and towels. So that's what they said in 1910. Listen to them in 1918. Nothing short of a repeal of the separate car laws is going to bring a permanent and satisfactory change in travel in those states where the law is in operation. And they continue. The very purpose of the Jim Crow car is to make such striking differences in accommodation and treatment as will suggest the inferiority of one race to the other and humiliate the race thus discriminated against. This is progressive. Let me keep going on. And I know there's a conservative side to this, but here is the progressive side. In 1913, they came out with a manifesto, what we want and what we must have. And this is what they want: well-built sanitary dwellings and streets that are paved and kept just as clean as others in the town are kept. Because in black neighborhoods, you didn't even have paved streets. 2, equal accommodations on common carriers. 3, franchise the vote for every Negro, north, south, east, and west, who is an intelligent and industrious citizen. Now there you get it slightly into the conservative, because obviously you don't have to be intelligent and industrious as a white person to vote. But they are still demanding the franchise. Number 4, and some of this is relevant today, equal treatment in the courts. Number 5, equal division of school funds. Number 6, lynching stopped. And number 7, convict lease system broken up and better prisons and humane treatment of Negro prisoners. And so as we go through this, I just want you to remember that there is a progressive side to this. And one of the things that I hope that we can get out of talking about the politics of respectability is the complexity and the nuance of this. The complexity and nuance, not only for its time, but then how it changes for our time. Because we live in a different world. And so we can't have a trans-historical concept where it meant the same thing back there for them. And I'll just close on this one last statement, that the scholar James Scott, who all of us were reading at the time, had this idea of everyday resistance. But one of the points that he made about that is that protests can evolve. It can evolve from the hegemony of the dominant group. Well, when these women, and so now I switch to my feminist theology chapter. When you read the feminist theology chapter of the book, they are doing something that is very subversive, because they are using the Bible, which is the hegemonic doctrine as far as these male ministers are concerned. And it is not considered respectable to tell those men, we want to control our own money, we want to preach, we want full equality. It wasn't respectable in the sense of that's how church women should be. How did they prove to those ministers? They went to the Bible. They didn't go to some other source. They went to the Bible itself, and they showed women who were judges, like Huldah, Deborah, and lawyers like Huldah, you know, women who were, even by Paul, given respect. They showed them that. Well, it's analogous to what they're doing in the American racial situation. Their gender consciousness is analogous to their racial consciousness, because they're looking to the Declaration of Independence. They're looking to the Constitution. And they're saying to white America, you aren't practicing what you put on paper, and we're going to make you live up to it. And in many ways, they were more outspoken than the men. And it's this group right here that made that known. Thank you.
Thank you, Evelyn. I'm going to try to get through my presentation without any side comments. I'm going to save those for tomorrow in the conversation with Evelyn about how we met, how we try not to wear the same outfits. We're sort of similar today. So I'm going to take you from where Evelyn left off. It's complicated. And I'm going to take you from the politics of respectability to Lizo at the very end. And so really I want us to consider that we have to look at alternative or other sides of the politics of respectability. And I want to thank all the people at Brown that put this together, but I particularly want to thank Evelyn. Those of us know Evelyn know that she would likely say, I wouldn't want this level of attention. And she deserves it much more. So thank you, Evelyn, for agreeing to allow us to have a sisterly, scholarly critique and conversation about your text. Like you indicated, lots of the conversation about the politics of respectability, particularly from some Black activists and academics, focuses on those 4 words, the politics of respectability. And when they do that, they often look at just one aspect of Evelyn's book. They look at the part that says that one path to racial equality is through the politics of respectability, how you comport yourself and how you dress. But they either miss the part about Nannie Helen Barrows' radical politics, they must miss the part about Nannie Helen Barrows fighting against racial and gender subordination. They must have forgotten the part about Nannie Helen Barrows saying, I have more brains in my 5 fingers on my hand than all the men in D.C. And they must have, I'm going to take us to a whole new place. And I'm going to go from the politics of respectability among Baptist women to the politics of respectability among women who engage in the underground economy. So some of you may have read my article. I often ask my students, did you read all my articles before you enrolled in the class? And that's why you're here. And I don't take a survey at all. But in any case, one of the articles I wrote was about a woman, Odessa Marie Madre, who, like Nannie Helen Barrows, lived in D.C. But she was an upper middle class woman who decided she didn't want to be a teacher Instead, she wanted to not let men have all the fun. She decided there was fun in operating an illegal business that did numbers running pre-lottery. She ran a house of prostitution, and she was respected in that community for what she did. And so, like Evelyn indicated, we have to look at the politics of respectability in multiple arenas and places in time. And whenever I talk about her, and especially if it's a really middle class or upper middle class audience, like probably many of the people in this audience, I have to say, in fact, that when she died, even though she was considered the Al Capone of DC, when she died penniless. And so even though she said crime paid and paid well, very well, she died penniless. And so LaShawn Harris makes similar claims about women who engage in sex work, with psychics and numbers runner. And let me say from what she has indicated about the respectability element of these women. She says, and I quote, "Black women's non-traditional, unlicensed, and unlawful work often complicated normative versions of respectability. Female underground laborers intentionally and inadvertently rejected, refashioned, and subscribed to different aspects of propriety politics." And then finally she says, "Respectability became a fluid concept, practice, and performance that was and could be altered and manipulated at will on a day-to-day basis, dependent upon one's social economic circumstances, priorities, and situational context." And so, for some reason, I'm really fascinated with Black radical women. It may have something to do with my own past. But one of the women who I became really fascinated with is Gloria Richardson. And like maybe many of you, I thought actually when I began to write about her that she had passed because she really was no longer on the civil rights scene, but she in fact had moved to New York. And she came from a very upper middle class family in DC, but she refuted the kind of civil rights politics of Martin Luther King. She didn't believe that you could fight violence with nonviolence. She advocated that you responded to violence with violence, which of course made her out of favor with Dr. Martin Luther King. She also thought that the civil rights movement shouldn't just be about civil rights, but about an economic agenda, which she then was opposed to King's position. And she's in the middle there with her iconic sheath dress and heels. This is how she looked. Sometimes she went to protest like this. This is how she dressed and presented herself when she went to a meeting with the then Attorney General Robert Kennedy. But fully attired in this dress with these mainly male civil rights figures, when she left that meeting with Robert Kennedy, he warned her against continuing to protest in Cambridge, Maryland, and Eastern Shore. And the day she left that meeting, refusing to accept his moderate and conservative offers, refusing to no longer publicly protest, that same day she went home. Her mother was arrested, she was arrested, and her daughter was arrested. And so she's a fascinating person to me. Even though she comes from an upper middle class identity and family, she was always supporting working class people, and her comportment, her dress, may have spoken otherwise. And then I want to go back to Nannie Helen Burroughs, where I began, because if you saw Nannie Helen Burroughs and you just consider the 3 Bs, which a lot of conservative opponents of the politics of respectability will talk about, the broom, the Bible, and the bath, I want us to think about another way to reimagine Nannie Helen Burroughs, and that is as a dangerous radical. And that's what the Woodrow Wilson administration had her surveilled by the FBI, because this same person who argued for the Bible and the bath also argued of a radical politics. And she wrote to Wilson asking him to do more for blacks during the World War I. I write about her I have another slide. I write about her as the goddess of liberty, and that is her advocacy of radical politics. And I also recently written about her as a race woman. And I wrote about Nannie Helen Burroughs in the context of Louise Thompson Patterson, who was a leftist, and Shirley Graham Du Bois, who was a communist, and Billie Holiday. And I had these 4 race women. And we were in Bellagio at a Rockefeller conference, finishing up a book project, and I was gonna just leave Nannie Helen Burroughs out. Despite all the great work Evelyn had done, I was just gonna leave her out because she wasn't radical enough. And so fortunately, Elsa Barkley Brown was in this seminar, and she said, I beg to differ with you. And I'm hitting the project, and she said, I beg to differ with you. She was probably the most radical of the women that you're writing about, because she had to go up against those black church men. And the other people's community consisted of leftists, feminists, leftist people, and Nannie Helen Burroughs. So I'm so glad I kept Nannie Helen Burroughs in that essay. So what we know, of course, is the politics of respectability, as Evelyn has written, was a powerful weapon of resistance to race and gender subordination. We also know in the closing chapter of Righteous Discontent, which was titled The Politics of Respectability, that Higginbotham speaks of Nannie Helen Burroughs' futuristic vision of a new day, of a real American who was more spiritual and humanistic than the American of present. We don't want to go any further than that particular quote, and to say, because we think about the present and the new day, and so that what Evelyn does in the very end of this chapter in the book is to help us understand that what she did, in fact, was to tell a story of African-American women in the making of the church, in the making of black communities, and in the remaking of America. And I want to say that I think Evelyn Higginbotham has remade, and I can only pick out 4 of these, but she has remade African-American history and black women's studies. And these publications and these honors don't just speak to that. Those of us who are in this room have been the recipient of long letters of support and recommendation. Evelyn never does anything just a little bit. She spends days, and unfortunately, she can stay up all night. I can no longer do that, and she does it, and I wish she wouldn't, but. And so I want to go another place with Evelyn. I think that Evelyn has given scholars the space to write about any sundry things, to claim a space. And so we see that in Wayward Lives and Wayward Women. And I think I'm going to just give you a little teaser. The right thing isn't up there. This is where we're going to be again tomorrow with Evelyn and myself and Andy Bisley. We were young, but we were at the University of Maryland, and I had 2 other slides, but I think it's on an early version. But I just want to conclude with 2 other things. One is, if you go look at Amazon Books and you look up Righteous Discontent, there is I'm not sure why it's not on this particular version, but it says people also frequently bought this new fabulous book on black women prostitutes. So there's some connection between respectability and that. And then my other version, I had Lizo on there because I think this new generation of scholars will be writing about her under the realm of politics of respectability. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Yeah, this is really an amazing event for me, and I am so happy to be here because Evelyn has been a person that I have looked up to, even though we're the same age, just about. And she has always been so gracious and generous and understanding. and helpful throughout my career. And there were moments, being a historian was not the easiest thing to be, and there were people who sometimes just didn't like what you had to say and didn't like you. But when I became president of the Organization of American Historians, and I don't know if it's first, second, or third, but it was a few years ago, Evelyn gave me a present. I know, and it just really, really touched me because nobody had ever done that before. You know, who gives anyone a very expensive designer purse? Talk about the pinnacle of respectability. If I'm going to go and give a presidential address to the Organization of American Historians, I'm going to have a really nice pocketbook with me. So, girlfriend, I still have that pocketbook. and I thank you. No one ever did that for me. But, you know, I want to talk a little bit of the whole politics of respectability because I'm borrowing your analysis and trying to fit this woman that I'm somewhat obsessed about into this whole construct of, you know, success, helping, transforming, all while being somewhat reviled and dismissed because you're Black and you're a woman. And so the woman that I'm focused on now is Dr. Matilda Arabelle Evans. And Dr. Evans was born during the Reconstruction era, but she, in South Carolina, she became, thanks to the help of a white woman, missionary, a physician. She went to a university in Philadelphia, and Martha Schofield, who was a missionary, paid her way, and a white male merchant paid her fees as well, you know. She returned to South Carolina and in 1899, 1901, opened a hospital. She opened a hospital because she believed, and this sort of summarizes everything that she was about. She believed that all human beings, and especially her people, were entitled to health care, should be free, the right to vote, no obstruction, and the right to an education. When she returned to South Carolina, and this was one of the triggers, there was a newspaper headline that said, "The brainiest Negro in South Carolina is a Black woman named Dr. Matilda Arabelle Evans." And for the next 30 years, she devoted her life to try and make sure that African Americans, especially in South Carolina, in her community, but throughout the South, as best she could, would achieve that kind, those rights. Now, the thing that was very intriguing about this, and I won't go on very long, is that she opened up her medical practice, and the people who paid her fees were all white women. White women paid her fees so that she was able to treat black women and their children for free. She opened up a hospital, and she allowed white male physicians to bring their patients to her hospital so that they could provide better care. She trained nurses. She was so devoted to this one aspect of respectability politics, that she was the first person in South Carolina to organize a free health care movement. And around 1930 or so, all of the other doctors and physicians by that time met with her to give free health care to African American citizens as a right of citizenship. By 1930, she stayed up one night, according to one newspaper, and she gave vaccinations to 400 children so that they would be able to go to school, live longer, and take care of themselves. And when she died, the whole community turned out, black, across racial lines. That, to me, epitomized the politics of respectability. And I just wanted to share that little vignette with you about Dr. Matilda Arabelle Evans. And I hope that someday I'll finish the book.
Good afternoon. I want to thank Tricia and everyone here for organizing this event and bringing us all together. And I also recall my very first conference presentation. I presented a paper before I was ready to do so. It was recommended by one of my professors that I present this paper, and it was at, I think it was at OAH, but I remember it was in Reno, and it was about slave girls. And the two respondents were Darlene Clark Hine and Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham. And I was developing a relationship with Evelyn already for personal reasons that I'll talk about later, because we're not trying to tell her business up here. But I was a nervous wreck, and after that, and they were lovely, they were generous, they were brilliant, and they were helpful, but it should tell you something that I did not leave that conference thinking that I would become a historian. All right, I became a cultural studies scholar instead. Not saying it's, you take it as you will. This is my original copy of Righteous Discontent. And at the time of its publication, it sat at the forefront of new work in Black women's history, Black women's studies. It was a model of sophistication and theoretical sophistication, analytical depth. It brought together not only her skills as a historian, but it showed how widely read she was in cultural and literary theory, in just political theory across the board. It kind of set the bar really high, and I think about how the works by people like Evelyn and then Darlene really did. It was a shift. There was a groundswell and a shift in terms of what we were expected to know and do in the work that we did on Black women, which had always been important work, but it was just something something different going on. It was exciting work at that period in history and literary and cultural studies. And with her theorizing of the politics of respectability, Evelyn provided us with a critical tool and a critical vocabulary for discussions of Black women's lives, their organizing, and their artistic production. Her analysis of the politics of respectability, as you heard in her discussion, I'm so glad that she went through that discussion of it today, was far more complex than many people who simply hurl out the terms of respectability politics. Her analysis of it as a political strategy included a discussion of both its possibilities and its limitations. And I think that that complexity of Evelyn's analysis is often lost on those who fail to understand much about it and fail to, sometimes I feel like we need to go back to class and read again, read that book, read the introduction, read the last chapter. How it was practiced, as she said, by segments of the Black working class and working poor. And all too often, unfortunately, we hear it now where it's used to shut down any behaviors or discussions of decorum. It's dismissed as being a kind of policing politics, when the dismissal of something as respectability politics is a kind of policing practice in and of itself. So I was raised in a working class, working poor community, and Evelyn's book helped me understand how I was raised, because my upbringing was governed by the politics of respectability. Although the women who, not all of them, like not my mother and my grandmother, but my aunts, they were not living under anybody's politics of respectability themselves, except maybe in their dress or something. But my own work tended to focus on people who failed to, or who maybe didn't adhere to some elements, the more conservative elements of the politics of respectability. So in my second book about Billie Holiday, I have a chapter called Ebony Lady and the Politics of Respectability, which does a few things. One, shows that how Holiday's reputation, not as an artist, but as someone who had been had encounters with the criminal justice system through her own drug addiction, was often seen not as the right model to put forward. And in fact, it was because of Darlene that in that book, Darlene had done research for one of her books and come across a photograph of Billie Holiday with children around the time of Brown v. Board, and she's with these school children, and members of the NAACP had written perhaps not the best photo at this time on the back of it. So that, I discussed that, but I'm sure I thank her in the acknowledgments, but that's where that photograph came from. And yet Billie Holiday herself deployed a kind of politics of respectability in terms of when it was time to advance her own career. And so the reason why that chapter is titled Ebony Lady is because it's a story in ebony where she's on the cover. It's a beautiful photograph of her on the cover, and she is presenting herself as a kind of respectable housewife who has overcome many of the difficulties of her past. And I would say that even though many, as Evelyn talks about in the book, that some of the church women certainly do not see the kind of innovation and creativity in jazz and blues music, and that the musicians were seen as, kind of outside part of that street life culture, that the jazz musicians themselves, some of them, sort of claimed a kind of respectability for the music in order to get it legitimated, accepted as America's classic music. And I think that there's still a lot of work for us to do around the groundwork that Evelyn laid for us. And like Sharon said, I think that there are many contemporary works that exist in large part because of the ground that Evelyn was able to clear in politics of respectability. And I'm thinking here of work by scholars like Brittany Cooper, or even Saidiya Hartman's book that you presented, or Imani Perry's book on Lift Every Voice and Sing, where she has this beautiful discussion of what she calls Black formalism as a kind of mode of respectability inside Black communities, right? That is not for how we present ourselves in the face of white supremacy, but basically how, and this is something Evelyn mentioned, how people claim dignity and self-worth and self-respect within Black communities through associational culture and ritual and things like that. So in closing, I want to paraphrase Nannie Helen Burroughs, especially in this moment when people, it seems like the mainstream media and politicians are starting to get used to the idea that maybe Black women are politically savvy and sophisticated, and which clearly, if you've been reading, I'm like, have they been reading Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham? We have always been savvy and sophisticated organizers, but politically savvy and sophisticated. But Evelyn closes, and Sharon pointed to this quotation as well, but it's one that resonates with me, and I think it speaks well to our moment. I want to paraphrase Nannie Helen Burroughs, with whom Evelyn closes her groundbreaking work. And Burroughs says, and I paraphrase, "A new day is dawning for us, in spite of the fact that we are facing problems more aggravating than any other race in the world, yet have less material things to utilize in the solution of them." That's the quote, and here comes my paraphrase. "Yet, we are abundantly rich in the skills, the analytic tools, the imaginative possibilities bequeathed to us by thinkers like Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham and all of us who follow in her wake." Thank you.
Good evening. I want to thank Emily Owens and Tricia Rose and everybody at CSREA in particular for convening us. I do also want to thank Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham for opening up this space, which certainly will be 2 days of an opportunity to honor you, your extraordinary work, your many gifts to so many of us, but I think also an opportunity to convene us, all of us together. So I thank you very much for that, Evelyn. I began to contemplate graduate school in 1994. And in anticipation, I began to build a library. It wasn't yet one of those libraries, you know, that sort of library that has more books that you never read than books you read. It was the sort of library that contained books that I read again and again and again. And in New York, we had downtown on 18th Street and Fifth Avenue a secondhand book outlet, a huge one. It was Barnes & Noble's, and it was a treasure chest for someone like me on a budget. And I spent many hours scouring those shelves. It is in that place that I bought my first gently or not so gently used copies of books by all of these women scholars that you've heard one from today already: Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, Darlene Clark Hine, Sharon Harley, Farah Griffin, Tricia Rose. Farah, whose words to me during my dissertation defense, talk about generations, still burn in my ears. If you know Farah, they were spoken gently, but they had a kind of force that approximated admonition. But it was an important one, right? That all of the women who have spoken before me today have taught us, right? That there was always more work to do with Black women, about Black women, for Black women, through my own work. And that is a high bar to which I continue to strive to meet. So it was there in that bookstore that I bought my first copy, put my hands on Righteous Discontent, one of those hardback copies with the dust cover, of which I'm very proud. Today it sits on my inspiration shelf. But I was no book collector. I was aiming to make my way in a world of ideas, a world that too often had very little to say about early African American women's history still. Beyond the void, the women whose stories I was drawn to existed in a literature that too often deposited them into pseudo-sociological categories like elites and Brahmins and the bourgeoisie. And if I found that work unsatisfying, it is also true that there was either too much of high, uncritical praise or cutting condemnation in a lot of what I had read to that point. I can still remember the bus ride when I first read Black Bourgeoisie. That's a story for another conference, but it was that. So it was Righteous Discontent that taught me what it meant to really bring a historian's capacity for nuance to our subject. It was both critical and it was loving at the same time. It taught me that my questions, the better questions, were not the who or the what, but the how, inflected with the why. There was one graduate program in those years, I think it was Yale, that when you applied required a supplemental essay, one that explained the book you wish you had written and why. This was easy. I picked up my copy of Righteous Discontent and wrote what was, in essence, my first book review, a pretty favorable one. For its research, its subject matter, its theory, and its argument, it was the book I wished I would write. Though I added for cheeky good measure that my answer must be qualified because the book I really wished I would write was my own, right? In the future, that was what I aspired to. And if that was a little cheeky, I now know that Evelyn would approve, that she would not want me to set my bar simply to come behind her, but to find my own way to make my mark, and that has always been true. I needed Righteous Discontent in the years that followed like a Bible, but also like a shield, like evidence that the direction of my work on Black women's history was indeed work. I sat across the desk from an esteemed faculty member the very first semester of graduate school. I sat there as I was told that Black women were not a sound category of historical analysis. I had no witty retort, but I went home and I reread Righteous Discontent, and I knew that my distinguished professor was distinctively wrong. I'd given up a great deal when I came to graduate school. I'd had a first career, and in those first months, I choked. It was the first time I chanced to write that essay, to finally conduct my own research, produce my own ideas, and it appeared that I might not have any. I got a little more than chiding from my faculty, my favorite line of all graduate school. "A great historian can write the history of garbage, Martha. Oscar Handlin once said that. Now I say that to you." I fought back tears, and I headed to the archive, a messy collection called the African American Biographical Dictionaries. It was still on microfiche in those years. And I weighed my way through the materials, wanting to believe that I might hit on something. And when I found a woman named Mary Small being called a minister in the AME Zion Church, I stopped, because I knew Evelyn had taught me, even as we'd never met, in the pages of Righteous Discontent, she had prepared me for this encounter, had gestured at where I might go with it, and had conditioned me to know when I was onto something. Evelyn and her book were there with me at the moment when the project that became All Bound Up Together began. In the years that followed, I became very fortunate to know Evelyn as a colleague, a mentor, and a dear friend. There was a dinner party one summer when she invited me to use her familiar name, which I'm still too shy to use at a podium. But in those years, I was still calling her Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, right? The whole thing, which at a dinner party was awkward. We spent a year together at the National Humanities Center, where I was gifted with her insights nearly every day over lunch as I was working on Birthright Citizens. This is not intended to digress too far into the personal tribute that it's bound to become before the weekend is over. But I want to say that my debts to Evelyn are many and varied. So let me say something about how she sits with me today. These days, I'm an old head in my department where I am training new scholars in African American women's history. It is a pleasure. I like to think of myself as an open-minded and curious teacher, but as we approach exams, there are two things, only two things, that I will not abide. The first might resonate with you. It's when a student remarks that Sojourner Truth said, "Ain't I a woman?" Nod to Nell. I must nip that in the bud. The second is when the term respectable is bandied about as an adjective, and a pejorative one at that. At that moment, we sit together and wind the discussion back to the politics of respectability. What is the phrase intended to convey? Well, we had a master lesson already this afternoon. What is the valence, the tone, the thrust of Higginbotham's interpretation? I am militant, I confess, in this moment, orthodox, even thinking myself as a guardian of a historical interpretation that sometimes is driven right off the rails by my students. I'm thankful for this meeting and for these discussions, because I think I will learn how all of us are still safeguarding, but also stretching and pulling upon and expanding and growing out from the politics of respectability in important and insightful ways. And my students, thank you in advance. I'm at work on a political history of Black women titled Vanguard, and once again, Righteous Discontent is my constant companion. It still gives me license to ask questions about Black women's politics as they were practiced by many women, including those who subscribe to the politics of respectability, and I'm still learning. I've been reading the testimonies of women ejected from ladies' cars of late, women who aim to use respectability to challenge, if not overcome, the conventions and the degradations of Jim Crow in their everyday lives. Righteous Discontent first taught me that such women had something to teach us, and that their thinking and their practice were sophisticated, nuanced, and single-minded. What I didn't expect was how many of them were church women. On their way to conventions, traveling with husband ministers. And what has moved me deeply is their willingness to throw off the conventions of respectability in theaters and on streetcars and hotels and on railroads, in confrontations during which fists flew, feet were dragged, rails were grasped, teeth pinched flesh, and nails grated along skin. Women's rights may have been called for in conferences and conventions, but the battle was waged in lonely terror, the lonely terror of a late-night train ride home from such gatherings. These were the so-called respectable women, clawing, kicking, shouting for their right to be ladies. I'll never forget the image, and we've already heard her name invoked today. It's an adolescent Mary Church Terrell pummeling a train engineer with her parasol when he attempted to send her to the Jim Crow car. She beat him until the parasol broke. Respectability politics, indeed.
Thank you, everyone. We're just going to come join ourselves here. We're going to have to share our mics because for technological reasons. Can you hear me? Yeah? Okay. Yeah, it is kind of chilly. So this was wonderful. We have a bit less time than I had hoped at this point, which you can't hear me? Now, I guess that would be good. Thank you. We got so much exciting, interesting things covered already that we're probably going to spend just a couple of minutes here and go straight to the audience for Q&A discussion so that we'll have time for the reception. But I'm wondering if, and anyone can take this question, maybe you first, Evelyn, and just a couple of others. I'm wondering if you could speak to the importance of the associations that have been built for Black women's history and for, Black studies and women's studies in general. What role has these associations played in sustaining the field?
Well, Sharon is really the better person because she was one of the. Sharon is really the better person to talk about the Association of Black Women Historians. Now, I was definitely there at the beginning, but Sharon was a leading figure. So do you want
I
to?
would defer to Darlene, except for to say that when Evelyn and myself were graduate students at Howard University, the very late, my dear friend Rosalind Torborg Penn and I decided that we needed to do a history of black women because we would go to conferences where there was all this conversation about women's suffrage and nothing about African American women who were at the women's suffrage meetings, who spoke at the meetings. And so Rosalind and I decided, rather than keep complaining, going to the meetings, Burke's, other meetings, and complaining, we do our own history as a graduate student. I think only at Howard would you be able to get a PhD after you wrote a book in graduate student, but we sent it out 200 proposals, got one taker, and the rest is history, and Evelyn's Nanny Helen Barrow's piece was there. And I'm gonna pass this on to Darlene because Darlene received money from the OAH and worked with Gerda Learn and invited us to come there. So we were, in many ways, pioneers in building this history of African Americans.
Thank you, Sharon. I remember a lot of things about those early years with the association, but there was one moment that really shook me, and I knew after that happened, talking with Rosalind, that the women in the association needed their own organization within the organization. And what had happened was that being helpful to another colleague, decided to give a talk at the association about Black women's history.
Which association is
Yeah, we should probably make that clear too. Yes,
Oh.
Sala.
Right, the association.
So when we say,
We're talking about another.
no, okay, but
I
they're
left
different.
it open.
There are different levels of association, right?
She said she
I
left.
left it wide open.
Okay, but I do want to just give you this preface, though. There is an association, which I'm actually the president of, called the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. It was founded in 1915 by Carter G. Woodson, who's known as the father of Black history. Why this is so important is because that association for many years, and it still has conferences. Please come to our big conference in Charleston in October 2nd through the 6th. It's going to be great. But now, this is where her story begins.
The person who was supposed to give the talk couldn't give it, and so she asked me if I would give the talk for her. And so I got up and talked about female slave resistance. And I went into quite detail about how Black women, even as enslaved people, would try to limit, the birth rate, so to speak. And some of the things that they did to control their own reproductive, functions were abstinence, obviously, abortion, or infanticide. And all hell broke loose. And a group of very vocal people said, no, there was no way in the world that any Black woman would try to control her reproductive functions. And you're just making this up, and you're not even, worthy of all of this. And I was, really kind of shaken because it was just a theoretical, address that I was giving. I wasn't pointing to any particular slave women, what have you, but I was saying women want to control their bodies and their productivity, if you will. And the people wouldn't hear it. Rosalind Torborg Penn saw me and knew that I was in distress, and she came very softly, smoothly up to me and took me by the elbow and said, "Come on with me." And I followed her. And everybody else was still yelling and screaming, you know. But it was Rosalind who took me to this very quiet corner in this hotel in Washington, D.C. And she said, "Darlene, we would welcome you to become a Black woman historian, but would you try not to be so incendiary?"
Well, the association part is that Darlene Clark Hyde and Rosalind Turborg Penn were co-founders and a few others of the Association of Black Women Historians. And after some conversation and some debate, we became affiliated with the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, and we have sessions at their meetings. We have a fabulous luncheon. We give out the book awards for the best book in Black women's history, and several people, including Ashley Farmer, have either been the recipients of that award. So thanks to Evelyn, we do lots of sessions. But I think that's what you're asking.
Yes. Well, I was asking, I'm going to ask a different question because I don't want to ask that one again. But what I was really focusing on was how important it is for there to be organizations dedicated specifically to the study of Black people and Black women in particular, why they're so important now. Because there's kind of an assumption that all of this progress has provided the context for disciplines to be not just embracing, but to be able to analytically frame the research questions in ways that are productive. And it seems quite clear that may not be so, and that organizations like the ones that were talked about here address that. That was where I was going. But I have a new question, and then you all can line up at the mics, because as soon as I'm done with this question, you're up, okay? So anyone who wants to chit-chat should join in. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the presumed tensions between Black studies and feminist studies or women's studies, right? That Black women sort of fall in the middle of this intersection. Historically, that's been, a kind of way of understanding it. I wonder if any of you could speak, especially those who haven't had a chance to talk yet, about, whether or not this kind of binary and tension still exists. If not, how did it get resolved? If so, what should we do about that, and how does it impact your own work? Or anyone, or any one of those 11 questions would be fine.
I will chime in when they finish as the longtime chair of African American Studies Department at the University of Maryland that had one of the premier programs in Black women's history. Women's Studies. Okay, so at the University of Maryland, we have a certificate program in Black Women's Studies, and you have to take half the coursework in African American Studies Department and the half in Women's Studies. Is very, very popular, but the point I'm making about being chair is that we did pioneer work in Black Women's Studies, and so we also have co-hires, people who are who are faculty in both departments. So for years, the University of Maryland had some of the premier scholars in Black women's studies on the campus affiliated with African American studies.
I would say, well, when we were coming through, Tricia, because we are contemporaries, right, that that was the tension that was spoken about often, right? And so everyone talked about the book, what is it, All the Women Are White, All the Blacks Are Men, but Some of Us Are Brave. And, certainly as graduate students, we were reading people who were calling out those tensions.
Right.
And I think that, while things haven't been completely resolved, I would say that at least in Black studies, the sort of most cutting edge work in Black studies almost presupposes Black feminism at its center, right, and all the kinds of things that Black feminism has made possible in terms of discourse around sexuality, around gender identity, around, those things. I think we would not even be having those discussions in Black studies, quite frankly, if it weren't for the work of Black feminist scholars, historians, literary theorists, and the like. So I actually do think it's a place where we've come some distance. Yeah. There's still work to be done, but we can see the difference.
Right,
yeah.
right, great.
because I thought you were going to talk about Bewitch and Toward an Intellectual History of Black Women, because, help me, I think that was 15 years ago, where we sat at a dinner and lamented sort of the seeming incapacity to intervene meaningfully or intervene in ways around intellectual history that were that stuck, right, for the field in general. And I think that the lesson for me out of that work is that while we were working as a collective, and this goes to your point, right? We create a collective with Barbara Savage and Mia Bay and myself and Farah. We work over many years as a group, much in the model of the way you all had worked. We struggle around being funded to do that work, and sometimes we do it on a shoestring. And by the time we sort of bring it to fruition, if you think one version of that is the book, right, on the shelf, we discover, right, that the whole field is growing up, right, right alongside us as we're working. And so by the time the book comes out and we have a public meeting, that conference was like 14 days and like, 3,700 participants, right? It was like Black women's history was there. It had arrived, and there was no denying us anymore. And that was extraordinary to realize that we had started in a very discreet way, but it had blossomed, and it wasn't simply us. It was all of us doing that work. Yeah.
And I also, well, the model that you have with working with women's studies, that's a good one. But I also think that Black studies is changing. So questions about Black sexuality, which we didn't talk about in Black studies, we talk about now. I think of the dissertations that I've had, Emily, Jennifer Nash, there are others who, now, yeah, Jennifer's about as, okay. And then, but Emily, with it's a really new way, and I don't want to get into this now because I know tomorrow's going to be really exciting, but there are really new ways to talk about sexuality within Black studies itself. Ashley Farmer, because she's got to deal with some of that with the Panthers, and these, so there's just new ways that now we are talking about it in African American studies, where I don't think we wouldn't have been talking about that 15, 20 years ago.
Right.